If you love Chainsaw Man and JJK, then you might have noticed this difference between the two. If you haven't, then let me start by asking you a question. Why is it that everyone has an easy time binging Chainsaw Man and following the new chapters, while a lot of the same people have a hard time following JJK on a weekly basis? It's the pacing. So in this video, I'm going to compare the pacing in Chainsaw Man and JJK, and explain the secret behind making any story addicting. Now, I know Chainsaw Man pacing is literally a meme, and I know some people even think it's slow now in part 2, but for the most part everyone loves it. Meanwhile, if you look up JJK pacing, then you'll see people talking about how the pacing isn't that great, or the pacing is all over the place. You even see people still complaining about how JJK is just fight after fight after fight, which is a really weird complaint, because it's like, wouldn't you want one hype fight after another? In theory, yes, but only when it has structure. And that's what pacing really is when you get down to it. It's, okay, how do I organize my story so that it keeps people's attention from beginning to end? This is true for manga, novels, movies, songs, basketball games, even boxing or MMA. Generally, the answer for stories is to structure them into arcs. And I say generally because, of course, the broader story will have an arc, and then there'll be arcs within that arc, and so on and so on. So generally, a story needs arcs. And here's something that should be pretty obvious, but it needs to be highlighted. When you have manga like Chainsaw Man and JJK, yes, you can read them on your own time, but they are necessarily told on a week-to-week basis because of the fact that they're serialized. Each chapter that's presented in the magazine is its own self-contained story, meaning that each chapter also needs an arc. This is a big reason why Chainsaw Man is easier to follow, but we're gonna dive a bit deeper before we explain how it plays out later in the video. Now, each of these arcs also needs 3 essential parts. The first part is the setup. Pretty straightforward, but still very important. The setup is however you set the stage. Maybe it's something as common as presenting the status quo of the story before the call of action. Maybe it's something as simple as a question. It's pretty open-ended, but you need to set the stage so your audience has at least some expectations. Otherwise, they won't even know why they should be paying attention. And this is an area where Fujimoto isn't necessarily better than Akutami, he just tends to be more consistent. To illustrate what I mean, I'm actually going to compare some of the recent chapters of Chainsaw Man and JJK. If you're not caught up to either of these manga, then obviously this is going to contain spoilers. Anyway, let's start with JJK. At least recently, each chapter will start one of 2 ways. The first is the more on-the-nose approach, for a lack of a better term. It'll be a recap, a flashback, or some kind of quick explanation. In chapter 206, we see Tengen and Tsukumo discussing the plan to dispel Kenjaku's domain. So, going into the chapter, you know that the goal is to dispel his domain. Chapter 207 is almost a carbon copy, except this time we get the version with Choso. That's the more conventional setup, because it's like, okay, here's what they're trying to do, now let's watch them try and do it. Other times a chapter will just jump right into the story with no real setup at all. For example, in chapter 205, it opens with Tsukumo tagging in for Choso, and that's kind of it. It's simple, but it's straight to the point. It makes sense because the chapter starts in the middle of a fight. But at the same time, so weren't the other 2 chapters. The real problem with this approach isn't a lack of setup. In fact, if every chapter in a fight started with some kind of flashback or some 3-page explanation, then it would kinda kill the pacing. The real problem is when Akutami uses this approach repeatedly. Where I personally thought this was a problem, and where I started to see the whole JJK is just fights complaint really pop up, is in the recent fight with Yuta. Chapter 175 opens with Yuta and the weird little bug man fighting. 176 opens with Yuta and Uro fighting. 177, Yuta and Ishigori. When you're binging on your own time, it's fine. But when you're trying to read that fight on a weekly basis, then that's when it feels like it's dragging on. And you would think Chainsaw Man would have the same problem, since it has a lot of fights too. But it really doesn't. And part of it is because of how it sets up each chapter. But before I explain why that is, make sure to like the video if you've been enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So let's go ahead and look at the fight against Yuko. Chapter 106 starts with Asa thinking about Yuko and what she's going to do at school. Chapter 107 picks up right where 106 left off, with Yuko attacking Yoru. Then in 108, Asa confronts Yuko and tries to convince her to stop what she's doing, as she turns her uniform into a sword. Chapter 109 opens with Yuko changing plans and deciding to destroy the whole school. Finally, chapter 110 opens right where 109 left off with Yoru confronting Denji. Notice how in this fight, there are those chapters where it just picks up right where the last one ended, but they're not one after another, they're spread out. What this does is make each chapter's story feel unique. Because when you read the Yuta fight, each chapter is just like, okay, more of the fight, okay, more of the fight, okay, still fighting, and so on and so on. But in the Yuko fight, each start of the chapter is slightly different, meaning that you have a uniquely different reason for reading each chapter. In effect, it keeps the fight fresh on a weekly basis, whereas in JJK, people start to get that feeling of, ugh, all I ever read is fights. Again, it's not like every chapter is like this in JJK. There's plenty of those chapters where it starts off with a quick recap or a flashback. The problem is that Akutami doesn't consistently start off each chapter with a unique setup like Fujimoto does. In fact, this setup problem is kind of why the chapter structures in JJK struggle so much. But I'll get into that once we've gone through the other two elements. Now, where Akutami makes up for the weaker chapter setups is in the second element of every story arc. Once you've set the stage with some kind of setup, eventually you need some kind of conflict. You all know what a conflict is, so I'm not going to go on some meta monologue about, well, what is conflict really? However, I am going to tell you why it matters. In short, they keep things interesting. Early in stories, they're usually the cause for the call to action, but even later on, there will be several other conflicts that help transition between the many arcs of a story. It's like in sports when someone gets injured. It's like, okay, now things have changed. Or it's like in a romance when a character gets an offer for a better job or a better school. It's like, do they take it and end the relationship? Do they try a long distance thing? Do they turn it down? If there's never any conflict, then the story just follows the same given path, and it gets really boring really fast. Like I said, JJK has no shortage of conflicts in each of its chapters. In fact, I really don't think either of these manga has any problem introducing conflict into their chapters. They both do a very good job of changing things up, where a character will suddenly interrupt a fight, or someone will suddenly get a new ability, or the characters will be presented with some kind of moral dilemma. So there's really no problem with conflicts in either series, and they're actually as popular as they are because they're so good at introducing conflict into each chapter. Ironically, there is a, let's call it, meta-conflict in JJK, due to a problem with the third element of every story arc. Once you've introduced a conflict, eventually you need some kind of resolution. Someone wins a fight, someone finds the answer to a certain puzzle or question. It's not so much, did you solve the problem? It's more, did you wrap things up, and did you wrap up your loose ends? And on a more abstract level, did you deliver on the promise of the story? It's this last point that highlights where the chapters of JJK tend to suffer, because on their own, the resolutions are perfectly fine. So for example, let's go back to chapter 206. In that chapter, the conflict is that Tengen and Tsukumo miscalculated, and now Kenjaku has the advantage. To resolve this, the chapter ends with Choso re-entering the battle, leveling the playing field and resolving that conflict. Now, I say that conflict because it doesn't really deliver on the promise of the chapter. The setup was, okay, dispel the barrier and beat the crap out of Kenjaku. Akutami mixes things up by having Kenjaku use some crazy domain, but the conclusion to the chapter only resolves that conflict. The expectation is dispel the domain and beat up Kenjaku, but what you get is, well, the plan didn't work out, so we're just gonna keep fighting him and wing it? It's not a bad ending to the chapter, because it does tie everything up, but the problem is it really only like half delivers on what it promised in the setup, which you can counter with, well, that's actually a good thing because it leaves you wanting more. But the real problem is that this will happen more than once. For example, chapter 208 is set up with a quick flashback to Choso reflecting on his guilt, but the resolution has nothing to do with that. The end of the chapter is Kenjaku confronting Tengen, which is a nice cliffhanger, but it's completely disconnected from the setup of the chapter. This chapter is weird because in the broader narrative, it does a nice job of at least starting to wrap up this fight, but in this particular chapter, the pacing is all over the place. Meanwhile, as chaotic as Chainsaw Man is, the pacing of each chapter is always on point. For example, chapter 206 starts with Asa worried about Yuko, ends with Asa confronting Yuko. Chapter 107 starts with Asa fighting and Yoru being overpowered by Yuko, ends with Asa supposedly turning things around. Chapter 108 starts with Asa confronting Yuko, ends with Asa defeating Yuko before she's revived. Every chapter opens with a very clear setup, even if it's something as these two are gonna fight. And every chapter ends with a clear resolution by delivering on the promise of that setup. As much as people meme on Chainsaw Man pacing, it's some of the best pacing in manga. It's chaotic and intense, but it also consists of carefully organized chapters that are structured so that each one tells a unique, self-contained story. Meanwhile, JJK chapters don't have the most consistent setups, even though the body of each chapter is full of exciting content. So as a result, otherwise well-executed conclusions fall short and the chapter arc suffers as a whole. So all in all, Chainsaw Man and JJK are both very good at mixing things up and surprising readers with exciting new plot developments. But while Chainsaw Man pacing is so good that it makes everyone want to binge it, JJK pacing is only great on a macro level. On the micro level, it's hard to follow on a weekly basis because the chapter arcs are inconsistent, meaning that the weekly pacing is kind of all over the place. Now, does this mean that JJK has bad pacing? No, not really. But it does mean that JJK has a harder time keeping people's attention every week, whereas people consistently read each and every chapter of Chainsaw Man as soon as it releases. But maybe you disagree. How would you compare Chainsaw Man and JJK pacing? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another Chainsaw Man discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my video on how Fujimoto has perfected Chainsaw Man in part 2. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.